the original question, repeating ourselves for this time, but why did you join the forces, Simon?
I joined the forces because I got into a sport of bother with the law. I was a passenger in a stolen car. And yeah, it just changed from there really, you know. My mother was a bit distraught. My family had broken up. And my mother encouraged me to look at the forces as a way of getting self-discipline, but I knew I needed something anyway. And I went to the military, was more than happy to go to do the selection courses and everything else. And ultimately my actual career choice was made for me because my recruiting sergeant was a Welsh Guard. So
sold it to you there.
So well, he didn't sell it. He just that's where I got sent. You know, I think that was for a lot of people. Once you go into a sort of recruitment centre or office or whatever, whoever they are is likely where you're going to go, or going to go close to it if they think that you're what they want. So that was it. My pathway was chosen.
Where did you do your training in those days, was it?
I was training in Pirbright.
Aye, that's still using it, aye.
Yeah. The Welsh Guards were stationed there when we went to the Falklands.
Right.
So Northern Ireland and the Falklands were all launched from there.
Right. And you said you went to...
In fact, Kenya as well.
So you did Berlin, Kenya, Ireland?
My first posting was Berlin, which was magnificent. Yeah. What a city. And then we came back from there and we were stationed there. That we came back in 80. So you can imagine the next 2 years was whirlwind, because we did Kenya from there, we did Northern Ireland from there, and then we obviously went to the Falklands.
Yeah. Was there any, because I wasn't around at the time, well I was, but I was too young, but was there, like these days you've got Africa and Iraq, you've got training, pre-deployment training, whatever, was there anything like that in the day, back in the day?
Yeah, I mean there was training for Northern Ireland. Kenya, you were going out there to train.
Yeah.
But the Falklands, we didn't have a great deal of time for pre-deployment training, but ultimately it was just a wet environment with few trees, you know, so it was a Northern Hemisphere type environment anyway. You know, so it was, the terrain itself was a bit unusual because they have those sort of tussocks of like gorse, and they're round, and they were nicknamed by the soldiers and things babies' heads.
Right.
But you tread on them and you could turn your ankle or break your ankle. You could injure yourself.
I didn't get a chance to do the Falklands, but yeah, I know a few lads have, but yeah.
I think it's a beautiful place, you know. It's Mother Nature anyway. Very rustic, very Spartan in many ways, very barren. Lots of lush vegetation. Wildlife is fantastic down there. If you couldn't enjoy yourself for 4 or 6 months down there working on a permanent posting or 6-month posting or whatever, you couldn't enjoy yourself anywhere.
Yeah.
You know, it was open. You could go running, you know, you could go climbing, you could go fishing, you could go canoeing. I mean, there's a fantastic gymnasium down there. There was a huge amount down there.
Yeah, sure.
And I mean, but I think it's a pretty special place. People ask me, was it worth fighting for? And it's not a question you've got to ask me. I was paid to do a job, not paid for my opinion. You know, as was everybody else. But if you ask the people who live there and who were there at the time, well, you don't even have to ask them. You just go down and see the Union Jacks painted on the roofs, and when you walk and drive past houses with the Falkland Islands flag proudly flying, but the Union Jack is on that flag, but the Union Jack flying as well. They're very, very proud British people. You know, they're Falkland Islanders. They've chosen which country provides them with security, and they've chosen which country's laws to abide by, and which educational standards they're set, and they do it all very, very well. And they've created a great legacy from the Falklands by creating businesses, and they've got quite a few multi-millionaires down there. You know, and there's virtually no employment down there unless either you don't want to work or you can't work. And as I found out throughout life, there's very little that precludes you from work. In the way of disabilities. So largely most of the people who don't work down there don't want to. Or the ones who don't work don't want to. I mean, the others have all got 3 and 4 jobs. They're probably one of the most industrious places I've ever been with people. They're hard working, grafting people, and they're lovely. I really like the islanders. They're island people, so they've got that island people mentality, you know. But once you get used to that, then you know they're just pretty wonderful people. I think they're incredibly stoic, but in the way that they've created their own world and capitalised on what happened in '82, I think they're incredible people. They're industrious. They're so positive. And yeah, you go back and you feel a tinge of pride in the fact that you took part in something that liberated people that had been put under the cosh by somebody else's jackboot just because of the issues and the problems they had in their own country at the time. And you look back at it and you think, you know, damn, they've taken something good out of something that's so negative in the fact that we had to go to war. But, you know, good on them, good on them. But if they decided to become Argentinian tomorrow, if that was their choice, then good on them as well. I mean, that's their choice. Nobody has the right to take away your democracy, your right to self-determination, your liberty. Nobody has the right to take that away unless you've done something wrong and you've been thrown in jail. But other than that, these people have done nothing wrong. And Galtieri invaded. So I think those people deserve to be liberated to make their own choice. And whatever that choice is now, or in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, that's their choice. And we must leave it in their hands. Yeah, that's what we must do.
Just a brief recollection of the timeline of events. So where were you when, like, the Falklands were invaded? Were you aware that obviously someone was about to kick off, and was it fed down to you from the top brass and
no, well, it was on the news.
Yeah,
it was on the news. I mean, but in all honesty, I wasn't paying a great deal of attention to it, and I wouldn't have been on my own.
Yeah,
most of the Marines, paras I've ever talked to, sailors, you know, the RAF didn't have a huge amount of input in the actual contest down there. But as far as Ascension Island, the RAF were very busy. But most of us had no input at all, you know, in the way of our thought process to what was going on and where it was happening. The Marines knew where it was because they were the only ones who went there along with the Royal Navy.
Aye.
But the rest of it, no.
Yeah.
Like a lot of guys, I thought, why were they invading the north of Scotland? You know, the Falklands, the Shetlands, the Falklands, because you're only listening half concentrating when you're listening to the news. And I was only sort of 20, so I really wasn't that worried or interested. If we were going to go, we were going to go. Nobody knew who was going. You pretty much could have put your house on the Marines and Paras going. Marines definitely, because the amphibious assault side of it, and the Marines had more knowledge of the place than anybody else. The Paras, maybe, you know, not all the Paras went. You know, one Para didn't go, 2 and 3 went. But one Para didn't go. So it wasn't a given that the Paras were going to go. And then everybody else who was able to make a case to send whose regiment. And the Guards went, I suppose, because maybe somebody there made a better case than somebody else. Not for me to say, I don't know, I don't really care. We got sent and that was it.
Was it a convoy of ships going sailing out there?
No, they went in the first wave and a lot of the ships went quickly. So they'd obviously prepared for that type of immediate sort of fleet movement. But we were the second wave, so we went out on the QE2.
Right.
It was hell, but somebody had to rough it. It was bloody great on there. It was good, yeah. But she was chosen because she was the biggest boat we had in the civilian or military fleet. Mm. So that's why she was chosen, and she was the only one who could travel that quickly as well.
And how long were you there before the incident with the Galahad started?
Well, we'd been landed about 5 or 6 days, and we'd taken over the position that two para had originally dug in on, and then they got marched to the top of this mountain, and we marched up there towards the end and said hello to them and got marched back down again, which is standard practice, do the old the Grand Old Duke of York. But it was all the scenario that involved the Welsh Guards was all created by the sinking of the Atlantic Conveyor. And the Atlantic Conveyor went down with helicopters, all the extra food, ammunition, all that stuff. Poor logistics really, putting all your eggs in one basket. But hey, that's what happened. That's for other people to remonstrate and sort of point the fingers and wag them. I'm not going to bother. And that started the whole catalogue of events. But if you believe in existentialism and you go right the way back, and like Shakespeare's Othello, from the moment I got into that car, I started to get burnt. The gravedigger scene, from the moment he was born, I started to dig his grave. And you can see that from every action there's a direct or indirect reaction that's going to happen some part in your life. And that's what it was for me, that's what I believe. So I don't point the finger or blame anybody. There's other people out there, they know what they did or didn't do. Whether they accept responsibility for their actions or not, it doesn't bother me one jot. That's down to them. It's their conscience to live with, not mine.
And of the, don't want to go too much into the incident itself, but was it a blur for yourself, or in the aftermath? I mean, you went back to, was it RAF line? Was it immediate evacuation, or?
No, I was kept down there for 3.5 weeks after being injured. They didn't think I'd make it home. They had to do a lot of preparation to get me fit to travel. But suffice it to say, in the end, I was starting to fret that much because they weren't sending me home and I was complaining. They'd operated, saved my eyesight. And they just decided, okay, look, we'll send him. If he dies, he dies. Pretty much.
Right. And you arrived back at Lynham. Was it
Bryce? I arrived.
Was it Bryce?
Yeah, we arrived into Bryce, and then I got transported from Bryce to Lynham by ambulance.
Because it wasn't you used to have was it a large hospital nearby? Was it
Broughton?
Broughton, that's it. Yeah,
RAF Broughton.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, that's when we actually sort of had a thought process about how to run a military that potentially could go to war. Have plenty of hospitals,
right.
and but there's always this thing they believe is like a peace dividend. But the tragedy is that you let so-called people that are supposed to know, they do their surveys and all the rest of it, but at the end of the day they get it wrong. I argued tooth and nail that Selly Oak wasn't the place to be sending soldiers, and I was told by generals to be quiet because I didn't know what I was talking about. I stood up and spoke about it, and in the end they opened the Queen Elizabeth military unit in the centre of Birmingham. And that was open to very little real fanfare, because clearly they had got it very badly wrong. They needed military hospitals. The amount of casualties that were coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan proved that. The fact that military hospitals, they supported the NHS in those areas so that they could keep their nurses' skills up on certain things. So I've always questioned this so-called peace dividend, because you're letting people that really have no right to get involved in things that they don't fully understand. Just looking at facts and figures, it doesn't get the bunny boiled, it really doesn't. And I think that sometimes people can make far too dramatic a cut just because they see that they can save some money here, there and everywhere. Let's be honest, you get the military at a real cut price, because if you look at the hours service people work, they're getting paid less than a minimum wage. They're getting paid less than a minimum wage, and nobody is doing anything about that. Soldiers, sailors and airmen, they should all be on at least £30,000+ a year right now. That's what they should be on, and they should be respected for the skills and the talents and the courses. If you were working in a civilian job, all of those courses and those talents would reflect in your pay scale. and that's what should happen, but it doesn't. You know, and I suspect that probably plays a huge part in why there's deficiencies.
Just touching on like the health side of things as well, as we were talking about earlier, we discussed my own mental health and people come back from recent conflicts. But what about for yourself? Was there any of that on offer back in the day, back in the 80s? There was nothing of the kind, was there?
It's great of you to think that it would have been that good. No, there was nothing.
If you were an alcoholic, there was heaps in place for you. For guys who had any type of battle stress, no, there's nothing. I got treated for depression. The first thing people went straight to was medication, which I stopped taking as soon as I took it because it started to alter my mind, and I didn't like that. I didn't like any of the sort of sedatives that they gave me. I really didn't. I stopped taking them. Didn't take painkillers largely because they were so powerful. They were altering my mind state as well. And it was just making me into a person I didn't want to be, and I was becoming very aggressive and very rude and awkward and objectionable. And there's lots of my friends might say that was who I was anyway, but I would like to think it wasn't. But you know, I'm not criticising the medical people. That was the practices at the time. So, you know, that's how it was done. So it's not the people's fault for following what's been tried and tested. What's happened over the years is we've become far more enlightened, and people are far more knowledgeable now because there's been far more research into it all. And they now take care of it a lot better than they did. It's still nowhere near as good as it possibly could be. There aren't enough qualified psychology people in the world to deal with mental health. But we now know, it's something I've been bleating on about for over 30 years, that mental health is the biggest illness on the planet. Not just in Britain, not just in the military cohort, in the whole of the world. You look at the amount of ordinary civilians who may have witnessed or been a part of something, or maybe their life is just not turning out the way they hoped, you know, and they're having mental health problems. Suffice it to say, my own home village, just a few days ago, a young girl of 22 took her own life. You know, the report hasn't come out, but that's what it's looking like. And you know, what could be so wrong in a 22-year-old's life that you would go that far? But we just don't know. And a chemical imbalance and everything else that goes on. So, you know, it's a big problem. But back in our day, no. There was nothing, didn't accept PTSD. That couldn't exist till January the 1st, 1987. And anything before that was wiped away. No, not our responsibility. The MOD didn't want to know. Primarily because they knew that the Falklands boys had been through so much. Little did they know that Gulf War II was going to come around and Afghanistan was going to come around, and they were going to be on for 15, 16 years. You know, and the fact that they've got a mental health bill now and a compensation bill that they've got to pay, you know, but the Falklands boys fought hard for that. We worked hard to try and help and raise the issue to try and make the lot a lot easier for the younger generation coming through, because we knew how tough it was for us. But in this modern times now, where you can barely get a home or a house, buy one, getting a mortgage, everything is just so impossible now because of all the financial rules and regulations that are preventing organisations from lending money, preventing people from getting on the ladder. You know, rather than helping them, they announce a scheme, but a scheme doesn't work. It has to be a practice, not a scheme. You know, and that otherwise people just not going to get on the housing ladder. If it weren't for the bank of mum and dad, a lot of people wouldn't be on the housing ladder. So, you know, so mental health going back in our day didn't exist. You know, I had very negligible help. You know, the MOD the British supplied the Americans with the information about psychiatry and the psychiatric effects of conflict for the Americans to work with the Vietnam vets. And then for them to turn around and say we knew nothing about this is so disingenuous. But then they did, you know, I've heard reports that, and how true this is, but that there was a deal done to prevent the American psychologists, military psychologists, to come over and give evidence at a trial. And if that is correct, you know, it wouldn't surprise me. We've seen how duplicitous politicians can be. You know, it wouldn't surprise me at all.
Just going off tangent a little bit, I've just got a couple more questions. I was speaking to a Bosnian vet the other week, just talking about this campaign, what have you. And he said something about, he feels that the Bosnian War was a forgotten war. Would you put the same label on the Falklands or not? Or do you think once a war's done, it's kind of pushed to one side? And
But the Balkans conflict really wasn't a conflict in the same degree, because we weren't there as combatants as such, as we were more like UN, if you like. Albeit that people did have to fight and they did have to kill, and lots of our guys did get killed over there, you know, and it must have felt, to all and purposes, like a war for those guys who were in it. And I met a lot of guys myself from then, guys from the Royal Welsh Fusiliers who had the most decorations from conflict in one day since the Second World War. You know, gallantry medals and all sorts. I mean, they were phenomenal. They did a fight in retreat. And in fact, one of them was from my village, a guy called Malcolm Owen. Malcolm, real tough character, nice fella, but a tough guy, you know. But you look at all that. The Balkans was very, very political. You know, Europe had done nothing. Europe let the Balkans happen. Europe as a bloc did nothing to stop it. If it hadn't been for the Americans and the British and the French Foreign Legion, to a degree, nothing would have stopped. That slaughter and genocide would have gone on, because the Germans did nothing, the Belgians did very little, the rest of Europe was impotent as far as I could see. So the same candidates went in, and the same people lost lives, as always, the British and the Americans. And yeah, I don't doubt that it feels like a forgotten conflict for some, because the tragedy of it is that I think largely it was an embarrassment, much the same as the Japanese prisoners of war have largely been forgotten about, because it was an embarrassment. Korea, largely brushed over. We lost over 1,100 men, 1,200 men in that conflict in 3 years. And largely we've been ignored, or those guys have been ignored, because that also was seen as a bit of an embarrassment, because it was, you know, the first UN conflict, and it really wasn't controlled or dealt with properly, because everybody was flexing their muscles and saying, we're in charge, we're in charge. The Falklands is different. Falklands is very different. Yes, could be seen as political, but at the end of the day, we were liberating an island or set of islands that we believe to be British, under British sovereignty. Other people can have their points of view about why it went on. The fact they discovered oil 35 years later on was not that they knew there was oil there then. Nobody knew about if there was any gold or anything at all down there. So I mean, there's a lot of posturing and people using hot air about it. At the end of the day, it was about freedom. It was about the right to democracy that people were being denied, you know, and we've seen that being played out in our country right now. People denying democracy, you know, and we've seen how that's polarized people. You know, you shouldn't make the same mistake when people have to go to war and fight and get killed and kill others for that. You know, it's not the same as political sort of hissy fits. This was totally different. And yes, it is a slightly forgotten conflict, because everything, when you get to Remembrance Sunday, all people talk about is the First World War and the Second World War. It may have been the start, but there is very little true acknowledgement of the almost 150, 160 conflicts we've been involved in since the Second World War. There's no mention of the 1 year that we've been in the last 120 years where somebody hasn't died in conflict. You know, there needs to be more mention of all of the things that went on. You know, the RAF have done so much more than the Second World War. The Second World War, without a doubt, their finest hour, their finest moment, when they were still in their infancy as a unit, as a complete force. But they were in their infancy. You know, they've done so much in other things, in humanitarian ways, throughout the years they've existed. Why do we not talk about that? Why do we not talk about what the Navy has contributed to so many different things? You know, we always seem to be focused on the same grisly, grim moments. You know, the First World War, yeah, but it was of its time. The Second World War, of its time. You know, things have happened and moved on. Are we going to be talking about Afghanistan and Iraq in 60, 70 years' time, or are we going to forget what went on there? Because, let's be honest about it, Iraq and Afghanistan were very political. The reasons we all got involved, or everybody got involved in that, was because of politics. Not because there was another really good reason. For me, there was a reason to go to Afghanistan, not to Iraq.
Yeah, I agree.
You know, so will we forget and push them under the carpet and the kids never talk about them? Will we still be talking about the First and Second World Wars? And ignoring all the sacrifice that's been made by the thousands and thousands of people and the loss of civilian lives, and in Iraq, that never needed to happen. That never needed to happen. So will politics manage to brush that under the table? You know, or will we talk about it? The Falklands, the problem we've got about that, it's seen as being a one party from this country, their conflict. The other parties hate that because they're not in it. They're not part of the rhetoric, they're not part of the books. So, you know, yes, if they're ever in power, they will not talk about it. I'm pretty certain about that because of their distaste for the leader of the time. So, yes, to a degree, but largely the Falklands has managed to stay on the agenda, in part because of myself, being on TV, being on debates, being involved in things that whenever the Argentinians raised the issue about sovereignty, I was always asked my opinion. And because I've had a public profile since. So I think that when you look at it in its entirety, we have been forgotten to a degree, but managed to sort of scramble our way back into the media's eye because of the part that I've been able to play since. But we were fortunate that we had Prince Andrew down there with us, so that shone a bit more light on it all. And then also there were other things that went on, medals and such like that were awarded. So fortunately we've had different things that have gone on that supported us being in, but it's going to be forgotten in another 10 or 20 years time, because 20 years time I'll be almost 80. You know, and a lot of my comrades and people I was down there with, they'll be dead. So, you know, you're starting to look at us then, the Second World War veterans are being looked at now. So, you know, it has to be looked at in those ways. So it's only right and fitting that people talk about all of these things and talk about all of the action. You know, the problem we've got is we know very little about what went on in Afghanistan in truth. There has been, even though they talk about this, that and the other, they haven't really shown anything. They haven't really shown anything.
Pockets of information about certain key battles, but
and they've kept the British military then on the back burner. You know, it was all right to get the public sympathy, but when the public sympathy started turning against the politicians, you know, like Royal Wootton Bassett, they went, this is what we do. The PR people came in and went, we'll move it to be more private. Whereas the families were actually they were feeling the love from the more public, but the government were feeling the pressure from the more public as well. And that's why they did it. You know, no two ways about that. You know, and that took away some of the impetus and the power that the ordinary person had. And that's wrong. You know, that's wrong.
Just a final one for me, and then going on the back of that, like a two-pronged question is how important, like you said, to have the campaigns like the Tommy Atkins one, and also what does the character, ethos, and spirit of Tommy Atkins mean to you?
I think it's hugely important to have a campaign to question, does the Tommy Atkins spirit still exist? To talk about the type of spirit that existed back during the First World War, but has been carried on ever since. You know, the Second World War, songs were sung, marches were made, battles were fought, retreats took place, injuries and death. You can't stop those. The second you have war, those are going to be guarantees. You know, you learn two very important lessons about conflict is that and the first one is that young people die in conflict. Second rule is you can do nothing about rule number one. You know, so move on. You know, so it's important, but the spirit, the indefatigable spirit that is shown by men and women who go to conflict, all you have to do is give them the tools to make them believe that they're right. And right will be proven to be the might that will win. You know, you don't have to be the biggest or the mightiest. Being right is what it's all about. And when you got to look at Vietnam, where the Americans in truth got defeated by a peasant army. You know, they had no uniformity, no uniform, running around in sandals. At times they were fighting with crossbows, and yet they still managed to defeat the biggest military power on the planet. So, you know, you need to look at it in that way. And the Americans didn't believe in being there. The majority of Americans, even the American soldiers, didn't believe in being there. They were fighting for the guy next to them. That's all they were fighting for. You know, they were ordered to be there, and be there they had to be. You know, and that takes real raw-bone courage. You know, and loyalty to each other, and that's the Tommy Atkins spirit. You know, the Americans had it in their own way. The Brits have it in bucket loads because they care desperately for each other, because their lives matter to each other. You know, they say don't make friends with people you're fighting alongside, but it's pretty damned hard when you're not fighting and they are still the same people you're going to be sitting and having dinner with and going out and drinking and chasing girls with, or chasing fellas, or whatever's going on, and those people become your closest pals. You know, so it's inevitable that you're going to see your friends hurt, or they're going to see you hurt. And the Tommy Atkins spirit is never say die. Never say die. It's do or die. It's being terrified and still doing it anyway. And that's just courage. That's just bravery on every level. And I think the campaign itself is right to show that spirit doesn't die with a conflict. It doesn't die with a moment in time. You know, it can be crushed, it can be destroyed by the way that we bring people up, or we choose to educate or not educate people correctly, and that can happen. But at the end of the day, for me, the spirit, when people do go through their training and they're made fully aware that the guy next to them is the most important person, and you know, all this statement about people fighting for Queen and country or King and country and all of the rest of it, well, sadly, you know, the King and the Queen aren't there in the middle of the firefight. You know, so it's only the people around you that really matter, and they're the ones you're fighting for, because you're fighting for your own lives, you're fighting for survival. And somebody once said to me, quite disparagingly and offensively really, that we were uninvolved in a small war. And I said, how do you constitute a big war and a small war? He said, well, a big war, they're fighting miles and miles. I said, how does that affect the person fighting here? I said, I'll tell you how big a war gets. It gets 100 miles to your right, 100 yards to your right, 100 yards to your left, and everything to your front. That's your war. What goes on outside that 100 yards there and 100 yards there, it's nothing to do with you, because you're fighting the enemy and they're fighting you. And that's as big as your war gets. And wherever you've got to then take that war to, that's where your war takes place next. Not over thousands of miles or on a global scale. That's not how big a war is. Not to the people fighting it. You only fight it within the parameters you've got and with the tools you've got. And the rifle you've got doesn't affect much more than 600-700 meters. Other than that, it's inert. It's an iron bar that's throwing bits of metal out that doesn't get to affect anybody else. So, you know, you have to keep everything in perspective. But the Tommy Atkins spirit is, it's, you laugh in the face of adversity. You laugh in the face of tragedy. You laugh anytime you can find that moment to laugh. Because if you don't laugh, you'll cry. And there are more than enough tears shed in conflict, in the quiet. And that's the Tommy Atkins spirit. The Tommy Atkins cares. He laughs, but he also cries. And he cries for those people who won't come back home, cries for the nightmares he's going to have, cries for the memories that won't go away. They just won't go away. And that's the Tommy Atkins spirit. And you still soldier on, and you still push on, and you still strive to be the best you can be. That's Tommy Atkins spirit. Tommy Atkins was a cartoon character, was a pastiche of people who served. It was a mimic, but it's as true as it's ever been, because it's engendered itself into being something far, far more important, relevant. It has such a rallying call to so many people. And for me, playing a part in all that was important. And to all intents and purposes, I'm Tommy Atkins.